Hello everyone, welcome to my channel. This is The Amateur, where we're here just to talk life, hobbies, politics, ideologies, what have you. And on today's episode, we're going to be debunking toxic masculinity. And first things first, I want to address my hair. Okay, because I wanted to switch it up. I don't normally ever wear my hair out like this. And just to preface, there is a big stigma especially between those of the Caucasian persuasion and black people and their hair. And if you delve onto hair TikTok, especially of black folks, you will go into a world that never gets lost. But pretty much there's a stigma about, you know, the curls and just this hair in my natural state being unkempt and unsightly, and because it's not Eurocentric as far as with the typical straight inline hairstyles that there are. To some extent, I can agree, and to very many extents, I can disagree. So for this hairstyle in particular, like, there's still products in my hair. You can see that, like, this is very unkempt, even for black girl standards. I don't really have a curl pattern, so that's like a thing that I'm just trying to work out still. But I told myself I was gonna put my hair out for these videos, so I'm freaking committed. It's whatever. And you're just gonna stuck looking at this hair for, well, maybe not too long, because I have a lot of videos to say, look at the shrinkage. Stretch. It's supposed to go back. See, my hair is, we're working on it. Okay, but anyway, for toxic masculinity and why it doesn't exist, like, it exists because people have said the words and have pointed to something to say that it exists, but it doesn't exist. I put toxic rap masculinity in the realm of gold at the end of the rainbow, unicorns, Hogwarts houses, etc. Like, it doesn't make sense. But what we will do first is see what TikTok has to say about it. You know, the source of knowledge and everything is apparently TikTok nowadays. So we'll see what TikTok has to say about it, and I'll go ahead and give my thoughts.
Hi, Benji here, and this is what toxic masculinity is and why we should challenge it. Toxic masculinity describes the societal pressures men face to conform to norms that are considered manly. These include being physically tough, holding social and financial power, and rejecting stereotypically feminine traits like showing emotion. The pressure to adhere to these norms is incredibly harmful. For example, suicide is one of the biggest killers of men under 45 in the UK due to stigma around men seeking help for their mental health. Pressures for men to be hypermasculine also contribute towards homophobia and discrimination towards gender non-conforming individuals. There is also a strong association between toxic masculinity and violence against women. It therefore benefits us all to challenge the toxic culture of masculinity and real men. Authentically holding stereotypically masculine traits isn't always necessarily harmful, but every man deserves the freedom to be themselves. Hope that helps. Bye.
Toxic masculinity doesn't mean that men are toxic or even that masculinity is toxic. Toxic masculinity refers to the harmful parts of what boys and men are often socialized to be. It can take a number of forms, like homophobia, misogyny, greed, unnecessary violence, and poor emotional skills. I've personally been socialized this way. Even as young as second grade, things like gay and girl were insults that boys would call each other. I was often told to man up for crying, and a lot of boys have a very similar experience. As a result of this, in a lot of all-male friend groups, you can say misogynistic or homophobic jokes and it'll just be business as usual. I feel like this needs repeating. Not every man has toxic masculinity, and not every form of masculinity is toxic, but some forms of masculinity are toxic, and we should call them out and change them.
Toxic masculinity is the byproduct of a misogynistic patriarchy. It's sort of like the rules that govern how men are acceptably allowed to act. And it is very closely tied in with the male power fantasy. If you hear anybody talking about alpha males versus beta males, this is toxic masculinity 9 times out of 10. It is telling men that they are only good if they have a career, make lots of money, and get a lot of power. It's telling little boys, real men don't cry, suck it up. It's men being so disconnected from any emotion other than anger that they don't know how to regulate their feelings. It's guys thinking that just because they have chiseled abs and they go to the gym 6 or 7 days a week, that they are owed women. The patriarchy hurts everybody, not just women. It hurts men too.
Toxic masculinity espouses ideas like real men don't show emotion, or says that being gay is a pejorative, don't call somebody gay if they do something that is outside the norm of what men should do. Real men don't talk about their feelings. Real men drink whiskey. Real men get in fights. Real men punch holes in walls. They don't have emotion, but they have anger. And at the same time says, women belong in the kitchen, and, women are there for a specific reason, usually to make babies, and that's about the extent of it. Women have their set gender roles, and that both men and women should fit into these gender roles. It's toxic masculinity is homophobic, it's transphobic, it's sexist, and it tends to be very racist at the same time. So it doesn't mean that masculinity is toxic. These are certain traits that are called toxic masculinity. I hope that helps. And this is Bacon.
Toxic masculinity is not merely a man being toxic. Let's try to get a handle on toxic masculinity. Toxic masculinity does not mean that masculinity is toxic. It's a concept. There is a such thing as healthy masculinity. Toxic masculinity is toxic. Toxic masculinity also does not mean that men are toxic. Okay? Toxic masculinity means that some ideas about how men are supposed to exist in our society are poisonous and harmful to men and harmful to the people in the vicinity of men. It is essentially a system that was created long ago through the lens of patriarchy and determined how men were supposed to exist that we continue to maintain today. That's what toxic masculinity is. And we have to challenge some of those ideas because they are harmful to how we exist.
So, Andrew, can you tell us about toxic masculinity and what it is in your eyes? Does it exist? Is it a farce?
Toxic masculinity.
Because you're considered the king of toxic masculinity.
Yeah, I've got that title.
Yeah.
Toxic masculinity is a term that was invented by women nobody wants to fuck to describe the men that the women do want to fuck.
Damn, son, where'd you find this?
That's all it is. That's all it is. No, but on a real level, right, this whole idea of being toxically masculine is complete garbage. And the reason it's garbage is because it's a first world problem first. Mm-hmm. Because when you put males and females in survival situations, or the closer they are to a survival situation, the quicker they're going to revert to their gender roles.
What is toxic masculinity? Are we really taking this one on? Yeah, we are. I can already hear them coming. Societal definition of this new toxic masculinity bullshit is someone who is a brute, emotionless, overly aggressive, solely relying on their physical strength. However, in order to do so, you need to first identify the definition of masculinity, which is being purpose-driven, intentful, and full of emotional control while also giving back to the best of his ability, etc. So, when thinking about the idea of toxic masculinity, which is having no control, if anything, it is a lack of masculinity because he does not have enough masculinity to fully be able to control his emotions.
Hey.
Mic drop.
So hopefully you can see from there, I tried to pull from somewhat different sides of the aisle as far as with those that are super adamant about toxic masculinity being super pervasive and prevalent in society, and some that disregard it as something entirely. And I'm more inclined to agree that, toxic masculinity doesn't actually exist, especially as these people are wanting it to. And my assessment is that it's just a total name misnomer, especially how it's described. So like some of the TikTok videos you saw, they'll assure you that it's not about all men. It's not saying that masculinity in and of itself is toxic, and there's healthy masculinity and toxic masculinity. It's not saying that being a man is toxic, etc. But if that's also the case, then toxic masculinity as a phrase of words has got to go entirely. Like it's not a helpful set of phrase of words, and it doesn't get to the root of the issue. And so let me see, before I continue into my piece, just to kind of define, universally define what we think toxic masculinity is. So toxic means either poisonous, or it's very harmful or unpleasant in a pervasive or insidious way. And then you have masculinity, meaning qualities or attributes regarded as characteristic of men. And so toxic, if you're just going to take those two basic words, put it together, it would seem to be something that is, toxic, harmful things, insidious behavior that men do, which is essentially what it is saying. This is bad things but specifically when men do it and not women, which is very misandrist. It's misandry. And Greenhill Recovery says toxic masculinity is a term that has been gaining traction in the past few years. This term refers to the dominant form of masculinity. What does that even mean? What does that even mean? Wherein men use dominance, violence, and control to assert their power and superiority. But it's also like, if we reverse the sexes, does that make it toxic femininity? And if that's the case, where it doesn't matter where the sex is involved, like it doesn't matter what the sex is and they do it, then it doesn't have anything to do with masculinity and femininity. It's all about the behavior, which is the whole reason why I really dislike the words toxic masculinity. Like, it needs to go as a set of phrase, like as a phrase of words. And essentially it's like pretty much what it's doing is we're now it's causing us to look at men through a certain lens almost, as far as with trying to, but only specifically when men do it, not when women. So it's like, is it bad because the behavior is bad, or is it bad because it's a man that was doing that behavior? And if that's the case, then again, that's misandry. But if it's bad just because the behavior is bad, that it doesn't have anything to do with masculinity. It's just because it's a bad behavior that we don't want repeated from either side of the aisle. And this will be me going into my next video. This is my next video, so stay tuned for that. But there was a comment that I made on another YouTube video that kind of talked about toxic masculinity, and I'll go ahead and read that before I get into my next segment, so just give me a second. Okay, so this was a comment thread that was under one video posted by a YouTube channel called Odin's Men, and he's just a channel that typically reacts to some pretty woke TikToks. So pretty much what I said was, there's no such thing as toxic masculinity. And someone replied, yes, there is, and this kind of ensued a back and forth between us. So I'll just kind of read that thread, because I already said my piece here. I'm just going to say it on my channel now. But I said, no, don't think so. There's nothing that is inherently toxic about things associated with maleness, which again is what masculinity is. So like, masculinity in and of itself is not toxic. There's nothing that's inherently toxic about things that are associated with men. But there's bad behavior that men do, which is not the same thing, because there's also bad behavior that women do. Sometimes it's the same thing. So it's just about the bad behavior. It's not a product of masculinity or a product of femininity. It's just a product of bad morals. So that I said, there's bad behavior in general, subject to both men and women, but not toxic masculinity. And he replied, and again, I'm assuming the gender here because it's YouTube and you never know. Toxic masculinity, sometimes called harmful masculinity, is often used as a catch-all term for the behavior of men and masculine folks. In reality, though, there's plenty of room for someone to be masculine without being toxic or engaging in behavior that's dangerous or hurtful. And I said, yeah, and it has nothing to do with masculinity in and of itself, related to maleness, and everything to do with poor behavior regardless of sex or gender, because that's like a thing that we have to specify now. I said it's a dumb phrasing of words that should stop being used because it is misleading, and it demonizes boys and men in the fact of them being male, because that's what masculinity is. It's things like men are naturally associated with masculinity, because you can't get masculinity without male. Even though women do the same thing, and more often than not, it's praised on some things. If that's the case, it's sexist and misandrist and still has to go as a set of words. And then he continues saying, I don't mind if men want to transition to women, and the same for women to men. People like you, blah, 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 and this wannabe alpha man are the problem for bullying and belittling people who want a safer world. Which again, is like they go to these ad hominem attacks and again assumed my gender, which I guess I assumed his or hers, whatever. So whatever, we're on the same playing field. But so even with that, it's like if a man were to transition to a woman, is he no longer like, where does the toxic masculinity just disappear? Where does it go? Even though like nothing changed. Not me trying to make sense of something that doesn't make sense. But anyway, So just again, essentially the thing with toxic masculinity is that it's misleading, it sets us up to view men in a way, and like view men and boys in a way, like anything that they do is pretty much toxic. But it's pretty much what I gather from toxic masculinity is when men in particular do bad things, but it's not because they blame it on the maleness, and they don't blame it on the bad things. They're blaming the maleness of the person doing it and not the bad things. Does that make sense? Okay, so closing off this video, I'm going to add my little 2 cents into a Jubilee Middle Ground video. It was feminists versus men's rights activists. Oh my gosh, I can't speak. Feminists versus men's rights activists, and they were discussing toxic masculinity. And the only thing I would say about this, and many of the comments under the video said as such as well, is just like, if Jubilee had selected female men's rights activists and male feminists, and kind of switch up that sex dynamic that was there. But without further ado, let me go ahead and pull this video up.
Toxic masculinity is real.
I think that toxic masculinity is definitely a real thing. It's kind of just the idea of what masculinity should be, but it goes wrong a lot of the times, saying that violence, sex, power, being a controlling person makes you a man.
Okay, so starting off with how she's first defining it, like, I don't think any sane people would classify that's how masculinity ought to be. Like, most men, like actual men, and one of the TikTokers said it as far as with what true typically it's a lack of masculinity that causes men to act in that controlling, because they lack that self-control that's expected of a man. That makes sense. We'll get into this further, but essentially what she is saying is that the ideal, if it's that there's this supposed ideal from society that men need to use power and violence to be controlling in order to be what is considered a man, and whether that's actually the case or not, I don't see it in this day and age. Maybe in the past, and if there was, like, I don't have any good examples of that, but it's just like, for me, the whole subject of toxic masculinity never really made much sense, because especially when you talk about the bad behaviors being exemplified in men to its worst extent, to its evil. So like, if a man wanted to come up and rape another woman, like exerting his force, exerting that control to get what he wants no matter the cost, and like, what I want is another man to stop that, like, as far as with understanding the dynamic of actual physical strength between men and women. It's like, when you go to the extremes on both ends, it's like, typically it's man versus man, not usually ever woman versus man, because usually man would win, and that's an unfortunate reality, like, it just is. And again, I'm speaking in very specific scenarios, especially where physical strength is involved, but like, typically if there is an evil man that's out there, you want strong men, like good men, to go against the evil men. So it's like, you can't just demonize. It's not the men that's the issue, it's the behavior and the actions, which, as I've been saying before, like, I'm gonna sound like I'm repeating myself, because I am, but overall her definition was subpar at best, and I don't like that might be what they think toxic masculinity is, but again, I don't think that's as prevalent amongst rational adults as they might think it is. Maybe.
And I see it in very unfortunate places, like when the young men or boys in my family, even from like toddler age, are told, you shouldn't be crying, boys don't cry. And what that turns into, I see it when I'm in a bookstore and a guy who tries to get my number says, why y'all always gotta act like that? And he sincerely had this like cracking voice, like he was hurt, but it was an entitlement. And that's
okay. So one, she's talking about telling them not to cry, and it's like, yes and no. It depends, and I think one of the guys comes and says this later, but like I think it just depends on what it is that we're talking about, because I've been told not to cry a lot by my mother, and it was usually because she pinched me and because I did something I wasn't supposed to, or I was being loud, I was being a child, and so she pinched me and said, I'll give you something to cry about, you better stop crying. Who can relate? Anyway, so it's just like, yeah, I mean, I think I've told this story to other times, and maybe I'll save this for another time, but it's like, I've also cried over things that I did not need to cry about. Like, it was legitimately unnecessary for me to cry over what was happening, and it's like, stop crying. Like, stop crying. Like, it's like you could have your emotions, but like, this isn't, there are places and times to cry, and I get that there are some, she might be telling, like, there's this stigma towards men that they need to hide and bottle their emotions, and to some extent that's the case, and this is not really this video, but to the extent to an extent that is necessary in some cases. Like, we definitely want men to have check on their anger, but when it comes to sadness, that's another topic, as far as with that vulnerability that's involved. And like, my opinion, I think I may have said this in another video, is like, not everyone is deserving of that vulnerability. Like, you can't, you don't know who you're sharing that with, and that's like the issue with some of the things that people post on the internet. It's like, we don't need to watch you cry. I sound heartless. I'm gonna continue this video. Oh, no, wait, I forgot my other point. The other point that she mentioned was a guy's voice cracking because he asked her out and she rejected him. And I'm sure she's not going to say how she rejected him, but it could have been the case where she was not as benevolent as she might think she was, and this might have been the guy's last straw, or I don't know how many times men get rejected a lot, because that's just the nature of how that goes. Typically, it's the men that's asking out, so when that's the case, men will get rejected more. Besides the point, man asked her out, she rejected him, and he felt some type of way. But like, yeah, rejection is not fun. Some people can take it with take that punch to the chin. Others, if one punch too many, So who knows? But we'll keep going.
Toxic masculinity, it's saying like, you don't realize how your behavior is harmful.
What does toxic masculinity mean? Is it character traits? Is it upbringing?
The suppression of feeling for a lot of men, because throughout childhood they're told man up. So because of that, there's a lot of repression.
I paused her in the middle of her speech, but essentially she was saying that toxic masculinity is, especially, again, like we come into a little bit of this misandry, but specifically in men, repressing their emotions or suppressing their emotions, and being told to man up. And again, it's just like telling men to man up. I don't necessarily think that's a negative phrase, but I think it also is an understanding of what it means to be a man, and my understanding is more along the biblical lines and the biblical understanding of what it means to man versus whatever it is that society thinks. It's not the same. They don't coincide, but usually being told to man up means to take responsibility, take accountability for yourself, because that's that's part of manhood. And I've said this in my previous videos, and I will continue to say it, but that is a part of manhood. Men just have a higher level of authority and responsibility on this earth, and that is part of being a man. So when men are told to man up, is told to take responsibility, take accountability for yourself and for your actions and for the things that you can affect and for the things that you can change. And certainly women can learn from this. Women absolutely need to learn from this, because that's what's lacking amongst most feminists and most women in general, is this lack of self-accountability for one's actions. Is always blaming anyone but themselves. Neither here nor there. But yeah, so emotional suppression, that is a problem, and that's not necessarily a problem of men, but that's just a problem in general. If you're, again, it depends on what it is. There are some things that do need to be repressed and suppressed, but you have to be able to learn and distinguish between what is good suppression. So being able to keep your anger under control, your patience, having that being in check, and so that doesn't blow up. but having an appropriate means to express yourself. But again, it's like you can't really trust everybody, whether you want to or not. You can't really express yourself truly to everybody, because everyone's going to receive that in the way that you might want them to. And that's, again, the whole problem with the internet. Like, you can't just share everything on the internet. Everyone's not going to receive it the way that you want them to. So, continue.
Because of that, there's a lot of repression. Repression then is usually channeled into anger for some people because they don't not always know how to express because they're told not to express.
So upbringing and
That's part of
environment.
it,
Okay.
yes.
But not something that's inherently a part of men. Okay.
No.
I think that, when you're showing your emotions, especially to random people, random women in some cases, they will view you as weak. I was raised by a single mother. I love her. She's my mom. I love her. But I could have used being told to act like a man. I think back, there were some cases where I was too emotional, and that negatively affected how I, what happened to me.
So with him, what I would say, because I think throughout this video, he is kind of seen more as the incel type, which he was kind of hurting the men's right side, in my opinion. But to his point, he does bring up some valid points as far as with, again, that emotional vulnerability and just emotional control in general. And I think I've said this again in my series on feminism. But it's like the masculine is, again, more about logic and order. The feminine is more about emotions and chaos. And the two are not the same, clearly. They're not the same. And so you'll see that, again, women tend to be more emotionally in tuned. And for some reasons, it can be very bad. Usually emotion and logic contradict one another. Sometimes they're in perfect sync and perfect alignment, but other times they are not. And with what he's saying is that men, in order for someone to be more logical, they have to be able to distinguish the difference between their emotions and the reality and the logic. And so if your emotions are clouding your behavior, clouding your judgment, you're not always going to make the most optimal decision because you're not considering all of the consequences. You're only considering how you feel, which is the entire leftist side logic, because there's no logic. It's all emotions and all feelings based. So to an extent, it's like not everyone, again, is deserving of your emotional vulnerability. You can't be emotionally vulnerable with everybody. Like, you have to be smart about who you decide to share your information with. And I think what he was trying to reference out was, at least if you're talking to, I'm assuming he's trying to find a woman to be a girlfriend or whatever, and like right off the bat, vulnerability is what gets two people closer together in a relationship, but like you still have to test, and I say test loosely, not like an actual psychic test, because a lot of women tend to do that, but you have to test and see whether this person is even, capable of being receptive of your feelings and emotions, if that makes any sense. Okay, this video is longer than I wanted it to be, but we're gonna keep going.
May I ask a question?
Sure.
What is your definition of weak as a man?
Not being as forward as you could be, not being as honest, or trying to be not as emotional as you don't need to be. You don't have to cry over a cut. I know, sometimes cuts hurt a lot, but sometimes it's necessary to be strong for the benefit of not just yourself, but for the people around you. It's fine to act emotional in certain cases, but I don't think it's fine to act that way with a woman. Maybe, you have a really good friend and he sees you cry, he's your best friend, and you're crying about something really personal. I think that's fine.
I feel like you're complete.
So, yeah. And I get where he's coming from. Again, if you've been burned once by a woman who's emotionally manipulated you, it's going to be very, very hard to trust open. I mean, that's the whole movement behind it's all men or whatever, because a woman had one really horrible experience with a man or several horrible experiences with men, and if that's all they see, it's all they know, if it hurt them really, really bad, they're going to project that to all men as like a shield to protect themselves, which is like, it's understandable, but obviously some therapy is needed in those cases. And so for him, I think what he's saying is like he's he wants to be especially cautious with women, potentially because he's been burned by a woman, he's been emotionally manipulated by a woman, he made himself too vulnerable. And this is the case too, and like I know I keep going on tangents, but like there are very, very, very maniacal, manipulative women, and if they see that there's a man who is not in full control of himself and his emotions, they will use that. They will pull at that little thread that's loose until they have it wrapped around their finger. And that's where you get the leading someone on, even though a woman has no intentions of reciprocating, no intentions of returning that those feelings and emotions that they know the man gives to her. But just leading him on, and like you'll see this, like I'm just in a relationship, or I'm just playing with him because I'm bored, or because he gives me this, or he gives me free meals and free blah blah blah, free la la la, because I know he likes me, and he thinks, and I let him think that he can get to a next level or whatever. So it's just like, yeah, that happens. Women do that. And to pretend like women don't is to be naive and stupid. And so for some men, like if they've experienced that, they're going to be extra cautious with women that they're trying to pursue a relationship, which again is like, it's a balance. It's a balance. I'm not a freaking relationship guru, but yes.
I feel like you're conflating two different situations, because you started off with saying a random person or even women. So it feels like, okay, this is a woman that you don't have a bond with or any type of relationship with. And then you mentioned, or in front of your best friend, that's okay to cry. Well, that woman could be your best friend. That, so.
I don't think you can be friends with a woman, so.
And so this is what I was talking about with the whole that he was kind of hurting the men's rights activist side. So I don't know if you heard him, but he said, I don't think you can be friends with a woman, which I'm not inclined to agree. I'm not inclined to agree with that statement. I think you can, but it has, like, you can't be sexually attracted to that person. And if you I'm certainly not sexually attracted to every single man that exists. So it's like, you can be friends of the opposite sex. It's just there's some intricacies and nuances that go there, but.
Because you don't see us as equal, as you said before.
I don't think showing emotions is a sign of weakness. I actually think it's a sign of strength. Men do live shorter lives, and that's because of a repression of emotions, and that's due to many things that patriarchy has instilled.
Repression of emotions.
It has been shown that a person's well-being, their lifespan is shortened when they are not able to express their emotions. In addition, when they don't have physical touch or when they don't have a partner to keep them company. We are human beings here. We need to talk to each other.
Okay, so she brings up some very good points. I think I don't have the exact statistic on me, but I'm almost positive that it's like that the suicide rate is 3 times higher in men than it is in women. Or men are more likely to actually commit suicide, whereas with women it's more like non-lethal attempts, if that makes any sense. Not that it's like a freaking competition, so don't take it that way. But men are more likely to commit suicide, and there is a point there where it might be an unhealthy, there is something that's going on in their heads that's unhealthy, that's driving men to that point. And she also mentions the lack of physical touch. And yeah, that might be the case when you have, 90% of women going for the top 10% of men. I don't remember what the statistic is, but like there's always two sides when you're talking about relationships. So it's not just on the men, it's also there's women that's involved as well. So like when you're talking about that, it's like that might be because you have women that are only going for the top 10% because they don't want to settle, and so you have men who are missing out or whatever. And not receiving that partnership that they might seek or desire. So it's just something to consider.
We need to talk to each other. And if you think that our health isn't affected when you're not able to express that you are sad or upset, you're wrong.
Okay, so I should have let her finish, but that was essentially it. That was all I really wanted to react to of that video. I mean, the full video is toxic masculinity real, but that specific question was them answering it. My answer is that it is not real, that there is bad behavior, and you can't just point to that bad behavior when it's men that do it. You have to be able to bring it out when it's both. Otherwise, it's misandry, it's sexist, and it's not healthy. But what the heck do I know? I'm just an amateur. It's giving Albert Einstein. You gotta be careful for those Gen Z freaking references. But anyway, let me know what you think about this video. It went on a little bit longer than I had intended, but this is how it usually goes, whatever. Make sure you like, comment, share, subscribe, and I will catch you in the next video. Thanks for watching.